Reconnaissance and open source intelligence are two of my favorite topics, and Maltego is a tool that most people encounter first because it's included on most installations of Kali Linux. Now, Maltego can answer questions that might seem initially impossible, like which employees might be the most likely to lose their credentials. We'll explore this and more on this episode of Cyber Weapons Lab. Maltego is an incredibly powerful tool, and it's easy to get lost in all the data and various options that are included. Now, in order to be good at recon and open source intelligence, you need to be able to ask answerable questions and lay things out in a way that you can actually get to the answer you're looking for. If you ask a totally abstract question like what employee would be the most likely to put their passwords into a fake website, for example, it's kind of hard to just answer that question if we don't break it down into steps that we can basically follow in order to find out which employees would be the most likely to do that. Now, in this case, I've decided to use a Maltego transform called Have I Been Pwned, and this allows us to find if a particular email address has been breached or otherwise had its password leaked, either through a third party or directly. So by knowing this, we can either go to the actual dump of the password where we can see this person's password that's been lost, or we can just see a list of the places they've put their username and password into and know that they are putting their work credentials into these various websites, which could violate the security policy of their work and indicate that they're not very serious about security. So let's break this down a little bit further. First, we'll need a domain seed in order to look for various other email addresses on the same domain name. Next, we'll need to figure out what the domain formatting is. So once we find a single email address, we'll be able to figure out how those email addresses are formatted across the organization and either generate more or recognize legitimate ones when we see them. Next, we can take any email addresses we find and enrich our data set by doing a poll and looking for various paste bins, which means large dumps of different organizations, contact books, things like that would include many more email addresses we can simply copy and paste into Maltego. Finally, when we have our complete data set, we can run all of them against the Have I Been Pwned transform and see every single breach that all of those email addresses have been involved in. Now, you'll notice that there will be certain email addresses that have been breached way more than others, and it's generally because these people put their stuff into everything where they sign up for a bunch of accounts. But we don't necessarily know the information that's been lost just because we know they were involved in a breach. In our last transform, we can actually select those breaches and enrich them further, so we can either get more specific information about the breach or even find our way to the password dump where we can see the password that person has selected in the past. Now, from the perspective of an attacker, this gives us a huge advantage because it gives us both a target, somebody who's likely to ignore the security policies of their organization, or also a potential password that they might have reused or used a password very similar. So this can give us an indication of how serious they are about security and also let us know what kind of passwords we could attempt to try to crack if they are constantly picking the same type of password. Now, this is pretty easy, and it only takes Java in order to get started. You'll need Kali Linux if you want to run it on Kali Linux, but you can run this on any operating system. It just happens to be included by default in Kali. So this is all pretty simple. Let's dive in. To start an investigation in Maltego, you'll need to first take a look at the various transforms provided by Perturba. Some of these are installed by default and they are free, but other ones involve needing an API key like Shodan, and we don't have one, so we won't be using that today. However, there are some free ones like Have I Been Pwned that you can install, and that allows you to run various email addresses that you find against this database and find more information about breaches that they've been involved in. Now, by itself, that's not very useful because you would have to do it one by one, but we can use the power of Maltego to pull in a whole bunch of different types of data and run that against this to discover new types of email addresses and even generate ones if we want to. So I'm going to go ahead and start a new investigation, and I'm going to add a single point that we're going to start at. In this case, we're going to start with the domain. So today our target is going to be SpaceX because they're really cool. .com. And once we add the domain of SpaceX, we can right mouse click and type in email, and that will filter and only show us transforms related to email addresses. Now, I happen to know that these first several are paid, but from here on down, is actually, these are all free. So I'm not going to use the email address from whoisinfo because we're going to get webmaster at and some other stuff. We'll use any email addresses in the PGP key server. We will search for any email addresses using a search engine. And then we will search for email addresses using @domain at the search engine. We've already got a number of results from this initial search, and by zooming out, we can see that most of these are in fact related to SpaceX. So if we want to increase the number of email addresses we have here, we can do a couple of things that Maltego makes really easy. One is we can use another tool to scrape email addresses and put them into Maltego, and it's generally smart enough to be able to figure out that their email addresses and add them to the list. So if we're going to do a search for other email addresses that use PGP at SpaceX, we can run the harvester and based on these results, copy them and paste them directly into Maltego. So as you can see, we have a existing entity that's the same, so we can merge them. And it looks like this actually didn't bring us many new results, but we can go from searching for PGP to searching for results in Google. And this should dramatically increase the number of results that we're able to find. So after this searches through the various Google results, we'll be able to have some more email addresses we can add to the Maltego oh, looks like we didn't find any. Strange. Usually we're able to find a couple, but it looks like we didn't find any this time. So if we had found some, we could copy and paste them in, and if they were unique, then we wouldn't have gotten the little complaint that there was an existing entity. But since we actually have enough to already do a little search, we can select everything by pressing Command A. We can then select all the email address types by going to the entity window on the side. And then after we've selected all these, we can search for pastebin. So pastebin will frequently have dumps of large databases like corporate email address books and things like that, that will have a whole bunch of different email addresses included. So odds are, if you find one SpaceX email, you will find more SpaceX emails. So we can basically run all of these through this search and see if we get any interesting hits related to pastebins that these email addresses might have turned up in. Now, in general, this is beneficial because it allows us to find more sources of email addresses beyond what we can just find from these scrapers, because a lot of the times they miss some of the good ones, and we can see here Diane at SpaceX was involved in a breach. So we can take this and actually take the URL, and if we want to see, in this case it's just her email address, but if we wanted to see something that was related to, for example, I think that might even be the same one, maybe not. Nope, this one's not available. But we have this other SpaceX pastebin where we can see a bunch of different SpaceX email addresses. Diane, Catherine Nelson, and some other media at SpaceX, Kristen at SpaceX, Erstini at SpaceX. So these are all email addresses we didn't have before, and I can confirm this by copying and pasting this into Maltego and seeing, hopefully, yep, a unique result. So now we've taken some results that we've actually found outside of Maltego and been able to paste them into Maltego so we can use them in our next step. Now you can really take this on a large scale and look for more email addresses all over the internet, or you can even generate them yourself. So what that means is if you take a look at the email addresses that we've pulled from SpaceX, there's definitely a pattern in the way that some of these email addresses are laid out. So if we want to generate email addresses to test, aka if we find a list of employees and now we know the way that SpaceX creates their email addresses, it allows us to be able to check for email addresses that we haven't necessarily even found because we know the way that they should be generated by the company. Now, we have a fair amount of email addresses, so I think it's time to run our primary query, which is going to be to take all these SpaceX email addresses and run them against the database to see if they have been involved in a breach. Now, this won't tell us what exactly was lost yet, but the next step after this should give us more insight. So get all breaches of an email address. Now, this may time out a little bit because we are doing a lot of different queries all at the same time, but we'll begin to see results come in and our map will kind of shift as it does. And we can also play with different ways of displaying this data with these tools on the left side as well to see different types of relationships. So I'm going to keep it like this, and we'll be able to see as this transform finishes running, different results, not breached being one, and then other actual breaches. Here we go, as we see that Catherine Nelson was breached in a business-to-business USA database breach, which I don't believe revealed too much information, but still interesting to know, and probably would actually yield us more SpaceX email addresses if we were to look there. So we can see that Brandon Spikes at SpaceX had his information breached by Adobe, which means he signed up for an account there with his work email, and they ended up losing those credentials online. So this transform, I believe, is now done running. I might even do it twice just to make sure it didn't time out on some of the good ones. But just from this, we can begin to identify a couple breaches that SpaceX employees did have and tease out a little bit more information about what they might have lost. So let's focus on the Adobe one for now while this transform finishes running. We can select the breach, and then we can actually enrich the breach data so that we learn more about what was actually lost in this data breach and figure out what Brandon might have leaked onto the internet in terms of maybe a password or something else that we can use to understand more about the way that he secures his accounts. So as we can see, our other transform is still kind of making things go slow because it is making a bunch of requests, but we can see that Adobe actually lost usernames, email addresses, password hints, and actual passwords. So here we can also see a convenient little description of what happened in October of 2013. 53 million Adobe accounts were breached, with each account containing an internal ID, username, email, and encrypted password. Oh, and a password hint in plain text. So that lets us know that this hasn't necessarily been blown wide open. That user's password might not be in plain text somewhere, but at the very least it is cause for concern because they have had critical account details lost. So this is quite a small sample set, but if we were to run this against a bigger set of email addresses, you would see dramatically more results and be able to zero in on particular employees that use their work credentials to log into other accounts. So this is just a small example of the way that we can take a point of very little knowledge, that being just the SpaceX.com account, find employees, find even more employee email addresses, even create employee email addresses based on who we know works there, and then run them through a database that checks to see whether or not they've lost any sort of information or been involved in a breach that was made publicly known. The cherry on top is once we find more information about the breach, we might even be able to find the password of the person who was involved in the breach, and that really gives us a lot of flexibility to know how they pick passwords and what their passwords currently might look like. In fact, they might even use the same password involved in the breach on various other accounts online because they might not even be aware that their information was lost in the first place. So this is both an example of how you should be diligent about reusing passwords because these kinds of breaches happen all the time, and it often takes a substantial amount of time for the end consumer to find out that their credentials were lost in the first place. This is also a great example of how Maltego can be used to track down information about something using purely open source sources of data, that being API polls, search engines, and all sorts of other fun ways of adding information, enriching it, and beginning to display relationships between it. So we'll go on to show you even more in coming episodes, but for now, you can use this to start to build a footprint of various types of email infrastructure and understand the various ways you can attack it. By using Maltego to collect, enrich, and link information, we were able to build a picture of an organization that we didn't have any other contact with. This kind of powerful investigation and others are possible with Maltego, and we'll teach you how to do more in future episodes. For now, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.